In fact, this talk tonight has given more coverage to him and his legacy than probably any other in 50 years, and you might wait forever for another mention. The Meyer line ended, but the Mises line was just beginning. He left for Geneva in 1934, accepting a dramatic pay cut. His fiancée followed, and they were married, but not before he warned her that though he would write much about money, he would never have much of it. And in Geneva, he stayed for 6 years, having left his beloved Vienna and watched the world go through the shredding of civilization. The Nazis ransacked his old apartment in Vienna, stole his books and all his papers. He was living a nomadic existence, unsure of where his next position would be. And this was the way he lived in the prime of his life. He was in his mid-50s, and he was nearly homeless. But just as he dealt with the Meyer problem during all those years in Vienna, Mises would not be distracted from his important work. For 6 years, he researched and wrote. The result was his magnum opus, a massive treatise on economics called Nationalökonomie. In 1940, he completed the book, and it was published in a small print run. But how intense was the demand in 1940 for a book on the economics of freedom written in German? This was not destined to be a bestseller. He surely knew that while writing it, but he wrote it anyway. Instead of book signings and celebrations, Mises faced another life-changing event that year. He received word from his Geneva sponsors that there was a problem. There were too many Jews taking refuge in Switzerland. He was told that he needed to find a new home. The United States was his new safe haven. He began to write letters for positions in the United States, but think what this would mean. He was a German speaker. He had a reading knowledge of English, but he would need to learn it to the point that he could actually lecture in it. He had lost his notes and his files and his books. He didn't have any money. He didn't know any powerful people in the United States. There was a serious ideological problem in the United States as well. This country was like England in the sense that it was completely enthralled with Keynesian economics. The profession had already turned. There were very few, if any, free market economists in the United States, so there was nobody to champion his cause. There were a few leads he had on jobs, but they were promises, and there was no discussion of pay or any kind of security. He ended up having to leave with no assurances at all. But in the U.S., Mises did have a major champion outside of academia. His name was Henry Hazlitt. Let's review his history here, too, for a moment. He began his work as a financial journalist and a book review editor for New York newspapers. He became so well known as a literary figure that he was hired as the literary editor for The Nation, a much more important publication in those days, before the New Deal. His free market views were not a special problem for him in those days, but after the Great Depression, liberal intellectuals had to make a choice. They had to adhere to free market theory or embrace the industrial planning state of FDR. The Nation went with the New Deal. This was a major reversal for this organ of liberal opinion that had long championed freedom and condemned industrial statism. The New Deal was nothing if not the imposition of a fascist system of economics, but the Nation set a precedent for the American left that this ideological tendency has followed ever since. All principles must eventually lead to the one overriding imperative of opposing capitalism, no matter what. Hazlitt refused to go along with this change. He argued with his colleagues. He pointed out the fallacies of the National Industrial Recovery Act. He patiently tried to show to them the absurdities of the New Deal. He wouldn't give in, so they fired him. H.L. Mencken saw the greatness of his work and hired him as his own successor at American Mercury before turning over full control. Sadly, this didn't work out either because the new ownership of that publication did not like Hazlitt's Jewishness or his free market bent and sent him packing again. In different ways, in different sectors, and in different countries, it seems like Mises and Hazlitt were living parallel lives. At each crossroad in life, they had both chosen the path of principle. They chose freedom even when it was at the expense of their own bank accounts, and even though their choice brought professional decline and risked failure in the eyes of their colleagues. Hazlitt eventually moved to the New York Times, which back then did not have the prestige it has today, however undeserved. And by the way, when he opposed the Bretton Woods system, he was fired by the New York Times as well. But while there, he used his position to write about Mises's books like Socialism. This grabbed the attention of a handful of American business people like Lawrence Fertig. It was Fertig and his friends who knew of Mises's arrival in America, and they were thrilled. They had seen what a devastating blow that FDR and Keynesianism were for free market ideas. They put together a fund that would provide Mises a position at New York University where he could teach and write. He was not paid by the university, where he was always a visiting professor until 1969, but through a private endowment. You see how this all links up. Hazlitt took the moral road, the courageous road, the road of sacrifice and principle. It was because of this that Mises, who had taken a similar road, could find safe haven in the United States. It was not the position he deserved. He would be treated much worse than the Keynesians and the Marxists. But it was something. It was an income to pay his bills. It was a chance to teach and write. He had the freedom to say what he wanted to say. That was all he needed. So we see how these two men of principle, worlds apart, ended up being drawn to each other because they recognized a type, men who were willing to do what is right, regardless of the circumstances. Each could have gone another way. Mises might have been every bit as famous and powerful as Meyer, but he would have thrown away the immortality of his ideas in the process. Hazlitt could have been a high-status writer with a major outlet, but he would have had to surrender every ounce of integrity in order to do so. Working together, they were able to overcome. One of the people who had been drawn to Mises through Hazlitt's writings was the head of the Yale University Press, Eugene Davidson, who had approached Mises about doing an English language edition of his magnum opus from 1940. Mises had already dedicated 6 years to that book, and it had sunk without a trace. Now he was being asked to translate it into English. It was a daunting task, but he agreed. Yale then set out to find referees to approve such a huge publishing risk. Yale first went to Mises's old colleagues, and they were about as disappointing as referees as they were in other aspects of their careers. They wrote that there was no need to publish this book. Mises's ideas were old, superseded by Keynesian theory. But Yale persisted, and Hazlitt finally managed to assemble a group of people who would endorse the book's translation, and Mises got to work again. We all know the frustration that comes with losing a file on one's computer and having to recreate it. Imagine what it was like for Mises to lose, in effect, a 900-page book, lose it to history in dark times, and being asked to recreate it in another language. But he was undaunted. He got to work, and the result appeared fully 9 years later. The book was called Human Action. By academic standards, it was a bestseller, and it remains so 60 years later. Even so, Mises remained at his unsalaried, unofficial position. He gathered around him students for his seminar, even when other professors warned the students not to take his classes or attend the sessions. They discouraged their students from having anything at all to do with him. The dean seconded their hostility, assigned Mises to the darkest, dankest classrooms in the basement. By the way, that dean was John Sawhill, who later went on to glory as Nixon's first energy czar. Mr. Sawhill. But for Mises, who had successfully navigated the wars at the University of Vienna, this was small potatoes and nothing to pay any attention to. Slowly his fame spread. But we need to remember that even at its height in the United States, it was tiny as compared to what it is today. In fact, Mises died a year before what is usually considered the Austrian Revival, often dated from 1974, when Hayek received the Nobel Prize, a prize that was entirely unexpected, in which he had to share with a socialist, and which shocked a profession that had no interest in the ideas of either Mises or Hayek, whom they considered dinosaurs. It is interesting to read Hayek's acceptance speech, which the Mises Institute published this year. It is a tribute to a profession to which he wanted closer ties. But it was not a loving presentation of the glories of academia. In fact, it was the opposite. He said that the most dangerous person on earth is an arrogant intellectual who lacks the humility necessary to see that society needs no masters and cannot be planned from the top down. An intellectual lacking humility can become a tyrant, he said, and an accomplice in the destruction of civilization itself. It was an amazing